Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. My name's Matt Hodges-Long. I'm the founder or co-founder and chief exec of a company called Track My Risks, and also the Building Safety Register brand that looks after the building safety activity that we do within the firm. So the first thing to mention is whenever we run these events, and we're trying to do them more often, is that they are always inclusive. Everybody's welcome. We really do believe Dame Judith Hackett's view on building safety, that residents are at the front and centre and at the heart of building safety, and therefore we never do closed door industry events. It's always everybody is welcome. So tonight we've got a mixture of residents on the call, fire industry professionals, fire services, management companies, not sure whether we have any government or not sure, but whoever you are, welcome, and thank you very much for coming. Please don't forget to tweet during the session. Our Twitter address at Building Safety Reg is on the screen there. If you want to use the hashtag of Building Safety Crisis, that would be fantastic. And if you want to join in on Twitter and say things to me or to the team or ask questions, then please do throughout, and we'll try and build that into our Q&A at the end. At the end of the session, or for the last sort of 20-25 minutes of the session, we're going to open up to Q&A. I think with the number of people we've got on the call and the amount of questions we've had sent in beforehand, I think the way that we'll run it, if you can put questions either via tweets or via the chat on Zoom, and then Alyssa will be curating those and will WhatsApp me, because I can't see anything, so I'm sharing my screen, questions to answer at the end, and then I may well call in various people from the audience that I know are here that I think might have a view as well. And if I ask you to do that, I haven't briefed anybody before, that I might do that. And if you don't want to speak, just wave at me and say, no, can't do it. But I'm sure there's a lot of people on here that would be happy to say something. So without further ado, I will crack on with tonight's presentation. So this is really just to let everybody know that the original idea of the presentation was to talk about the Building Safety Logbook concept that we launched last week. But with the announcement of the Fire Safety Bill coming back to Parliament next week, we sort of tagged that on the end, so it's a sort of a double whammy, if you like. But primarily it's about building safety logbooks and record keeping. So, let me just grab my screen back. So, where do we start? So we're 44 months now and a few days on from Grenfell Tower, and I don't need to explain to anybody what happened at Grenfell, I hope. But what we do need to say is that as a result of that, and as a result of what's going on with Grenfell, we've got this real focus on the external wall. The failings that the Grenfell Tower inquiry have established in terms of the internal failings really have been downplayed, as the entire industry really is looking at external walls and cladding at the moment, and not really looking at the management failings or the internal compartmentation failures and smoke venting and all that sort of stuff. But what we also found in Grenfell is the absence of information. There's this whole recurring theme of missing information at every turn, whether it's the fire services not having up-to-date plans or information, whether it's the residents not knowing what was going on, whether it's a lack of transparency. We keep coming back to data and information and transparency. So that's really a key part of where our thinking is in relation to building safety. So the government response, as a result of all of this, we'll have seen the public inquiry, which is still grinding its way through at the moment. We've had the Hackett review, the Building a Safer Future report, which reported in May 2018. We've got the Building Safety Bill trundling through at the moment, or gone a bit quiet, but we're looking there, I think, about sort of staging from 2023 with the new regulator. We've got the Fire Safety Bill, which is coming back, as I said, on the 24th. We've had our multiple advice notes and consolidated advice to the building regs. We've got the beautifully designed EWS1 system that has really stymied so many people, which again is out for consultation for review. And we've got the new regulator coming. So there's a lot that's happened, but this is 44 months on from the biggest peacetime loss of life to fire in this country. So I'd say that although we have some movement, it's somewhat slower than I think most people would have expected or wanted. So the scale of the problem, this is difficult. We don't really know. What we do know from MHCLG is there's 12,000 defined high-rise buildings, so that's over 18 metres or over 6 stories. 76,000 in that mid-rise category in England, and then the sub 11 metres, who knows? We can't actually answer that question at the moment. We've tried. So if anybody can point me at a reliable number in the chat, that would be really welcome. But ultimately, it's led to paralysation of the market. We don't actually know yet, and I use the we as the country, of where all these buildings are. We don't know how many there are. We don't know what risk ranking they have, because we have no way of risk ranking. The regulatory oversight is, I would say at best, is sort of everyone tries their best with limited resources, but there's no well-oiled machine for regulatory oversight at the moment across all of these 300,000 plus buildings. There's certainly very little transparency, and ultimately that leads us to not having a clue really what's going on. So 44 months post-Grenfell, we really don't know the scale of this issue yet, which I think is pretty worrying. So what are we doing about it? Well, we've already got some legislation in place. We already have the fire safety order, and that already applies to all of the buildings there on the screen. We already have the responsible person defined in law. We know about competent persons. We have a method of fire risk assessment. We might not all agree with the way that it works, but we need to fire risk assess these buildings, and we have an enforcement regime through the Fire and Rescue Service. So we have a lot that we can already do and should be doing with these buildings, but we can do more. We've then got the Building Safety Bill, but as you can see, this initially only relates to the 12,000 buildings that fall into the HRB category. So yes, we've got a new regulator coming. We have golden threads, building safety cases, resident engagement licensing, although it's not called that, it's an assurance certificate, and we have the beloved building safety charge coming through. But that is only for 12,000 buildings, and it's only from about 2023 onwards. The problem that we have now is already a 4-year-old problem, and it's only getting worse. So really one of the things we do need to think about is how do we bridge that gap? So we need to get the basics right. And on the right side of the screen there, we can see this is news that broke yesterday about a district council that had fire risk assessed a whole bunch of buildings, council buildings in 2017, and then it would seem not bothered to do anything about remediating any of the problems that they found, or a lot of the problems. Over 1,000 issues hadn't been resolved. And then that extends further into asbestos and other areas that also don't fall within the new building safety regime. So for everyone that's watching, the new building safety regulator, although it talks about building safety, is actually a fire and structural integrity regulator at the moment for the scope. So we're looking at fire and structural integrity for a very small number of buildings in England, is effectively what we're getting. And we're getting that in 2023 also. So what do we do at the moment? Well, all blocks, I've already said, need fire risk assessments already. The Building Safety Bill is calling for an annual fire risk assessment for those higher risk, sorry, I shouldn't use that term, buildings taller than 18 metres. There's a debate as to whether they're high risk or not. So if we then look at, which we've just done, a review of over 500 high-rise building fire risk assessments, 69% of those are not within 12-month age. So they are greater than 12 months old, some of them by many years. And we'll come out soon with further detail on that. So we've got an industry already that has been told, or has been through Grenfell, has been told very clearly by the new regulator and by Dame Judith Hackett that they need to get on with it. But still, 44 months post-Grenfell, can't even produce a fire risk assessment every 12 months for high-rise buildings. So to give everybody context, that's where we are. If we then go further into the building and start looking at passive or active fire systems, so dry risers, smoke vents, etc., there are very clear maintenance and testing regimes for that. There's British standards for them. And again, in so many instances, we can't find any evidence of this work being done within buildings that already exist. So this to us is very worrying. Doesn't require new legislation. It requires the will of the managers and the responsible persons in those buildings to actually do these jobs properly. And if they don't know what they need to do, then ask an expert, and then build a management system. So I've mentioned at the bottom, in recent weeks, we've spoken to one block in London where the dry riser was never connected. It's a 7-year-old building, so there's pipe work missing between the outside of the building and the inside of the building. That should have been tested for pressure every year, should have been commissioned at the start, and it should have had a visual inspection every 6 months, which wouldn't have noticed this, but certainly every annual inspection and commissioning would have noticed. Another building down in Bristol where the smoke vents at roof level were weighted down with bricks, and some of the cords to open them were broken and had been for years. And then a building in Birmingham where the disabled resident on the 13th floor bought the flat after being told that there was a firefighting lift and she could evacuate the building, only to find that the firefighting lift wasn't the firefighting lift, and had then spent countless thousands of pounds actually buying a special chair to get out of the building, and is stuck on the 13th floor. So these are just a few of the incidents that we see, which are all eminently avoidable right now if we want to do the job properly. So that led us to launching our manifesto for building safety last week, and Alyssa will share a link to that if anybody hasn't seen it for download. And that's really talking about how can we solve these problems? What do we need to be doing now to make buildings safe, alongside taking off combustible wall systems or retrofitting suppression systems into external walls? Whatever solutions we end up coming up with, we need a way of managing the problem immediately. So that's what the manifesto is all about. And you know, it'd be great to take feedback from anybody that has read it or would like to read it. And you know, it's a living, breathing document that will evolve over time. So key part of the thesis here is that we believe that every building should have a building safety logbook, in the same way that a car's got a service record and a registration certificate. This is what's needed for buildings. And it does a number of things. So the first thing to mention is that, and again, it doesn't have to be our technology, it can be other technologies. It's just, this is a mindset that we want to get in place, that there is a bunch of evidence for each building around fire and life safety to show that, one, that what's installed, what the materials are, what the systems are, were they installed properly, what specification are they being maintained, are they being tested? So we build this digital repository of evidence, and then we say, who needs to see all or some of that content? So you'll see on the side of the screen there, we sort of say, okay, fire risk assessment. Well, the landlord or the responsible person needs to see that and administer it. Residents should be able to see it. Fire and rescue service if they want to see it, and maybe the insurers at renewal time. So there's different stakeholders that can be permissioned to each of these pieces of content or bits of evidence. And we see that as being the starting point of the golden thread that Dame Judith Hackett has recommended or is happening. A lot more data capture can come on top of this, but the starting point is we end up with buildings with addresses, we know where they are, we know the basic management tasks are taking place, and then we build on top of that to evolve and interface with other systems that may well do the drone surveys, they might well do structural calculations or IoT devices that are talking to the system, but we're keeping a digital record. Most of that content that we would need in Golden Thread will also be required for the building safety case for high-rise buildings. So again, it saves duplication there. And also because we can implement this or share or permission to residents, we tick the resident engagement box as well in terms of information sharing. And then that ties into the building safety bill, fire safety bill, which I'll come on to in a second. So this is our view of the world. And then, so that's an individual building. So that's one building with its digital logbook. The next stage is, when you're managing a portfolio of buildings, is you have multiple digital logbooks, all working individually, but they have the ability of rolling up to give you a view at the portfolio level. So what's happening across my portfolio of buildings that I look after? So again, that is a key thing in terms of that management reporting. So if we look at whether somebody's responsible for gas safety or fire risk assessments within a housing association, whatever it is, they can zoom in on their areas of responsibility, but as a part of a whole compliance or management network. So we have our portfolio view, and then we go to a level above that, which is, well, if we've got multiple portfolios, well, if we can glue those together, then that's where the regulator can look at data. So whether that's the fire and rescue service in a county, whether it's national fire chiefs nationally, whether it's the new building safety regulator, whether it's a council, they can look at, if they're permissioned to, they can look at multiple portfolios together and look at activity across those so they can risk rank. So again, this is our view. We don't know yet, because nobody's really talked about it, as to what the regulator's view is of how they're going to do this. All we do know from a regulatory perspective is that a couple of days ago, Peter Baker was appointed as the Chief Inspector of Buildings, so he will be the building safety regulator from the HSE. We haven't seen a digital strategy yet from the regulator. We know from the impact assessment that they've got a fairly small startup budget, and knowing how government IT projects normally go in terms of cost, there seems to be a disconnect, but again, we're waiting for information. We know that quite a lot of the data management activity and record keeping will be passed to duty holders, which I think is right, is where it should be. They are the duty holders. We've talked before about 2023 as being the staging date for the regulator, and I think there's a 6 to 7 year lead-in period to get through the 13,000 buildings. So we're looking at sort of 2023 to 2030, whereas the need is two years ago, 3 years, 4 years ago. And the closest we can see to this in terms of the way our minds work is the way that Making Tax Digital has been structured. So there are multiple small business or business accounting packages like QuickBooks Zero and the others, but they interact with the HM Revenue and Customs system through an API gateway. So we would see ourselves as a company as being one of, a Zero or a QuickBooks, and we would encourage other companies that do a similar thing to us to engage similarly and build solutions, because I don't think it's either healthy or realistic to say that there would be any kind of monopoly provider in this space. So I think we do need a diversity of providers that hopefully are working in a similar sort of way to us in terms of thinking. And again, we would welcome those conversations with other people that are either doing the kind of thing that we're doing or thinking about it, to engage together. I think we'd all be stronger together to actually make this thing happen and make it reality and get the engagement. So looking at this, I think what is really important is that we embrace transparency. There is a lot of feedback at the moment around my managing agent won't provide me with this information, or they're being obstructive, or the housing association won't respond to this question. And then on the other side, we have, well, we can't provide this information because we don't actually have it yet. It's going to take time. So we need to be able to communicate. And I think my view would be, and certainly all of the residents I work with, when you actually explain the complexity of something and communicate and treat everybody as peers and equals, actually there's a very high level of understanding that things take time. There's no real excuse for not communicating. Understanding buildings as a system, this was a key thing that Dame Judith Hackett came out with, to say there are lots of moving parts within a building to keep it safe. We need to make sure all of those moving parts are working as they should. So it's not just the outside wall, it's the inside as well. But we also need to remember that, unlike maybe Dame Judith Hackett's view, we're not talking about chemical plants here, we're not talking about nuclear power stations, oil and gas platforms, we're talking about blocks of flats. And I love them, but they are pretty simple things generally. We just need to make sure that the basic systems are in place and they're working properly. We need assurance. We see a lot of assumption that somebody else is dealing with this, or of course it works because it's there. Unless you test something and you can evidence that test, there is no assurance. So our view would always be that if you can't evidence it, it didn't happen or it doesn't exist. So show me the evidence. And that's what we're always looking for within our business and within our systems is, okay, you say you've got something, that's good, prove it. Where's the proof? And lastly, making every building as safe as possible now. We know that we can't rectify every building or remediate every building. The external wall issues, when they're identified, will take a long time to fix. So unless the fire service are going to issue prohibitions on each of these buildings and turf everybody into a hotel, we've got to find a way of living with these buildings. So we need to make them as low risk as we possibly can. And I would suggest that if I've got a building with external wall problems, that's bad. If I've got the same building, but I've also got internal fire system issues, life safety issues, that's probably 2 or 3 times as bad. So let's act on what we can now and just gather the evidence together. So that's a very quick run through. I did say I would go very quickly. I'm going to jump into the fire safety bill now, and then hopefully we've got a decent amount of time for questions and a chat afterwards. So I'll quickly run through this. So the fire safety bill, Commons vote on the 24th of Feb, next Wednesday. Key difference, this is applying to residential blocks, it applies to more than residential blocks, but if we focus on residential blocks of all heights. There's been a lot of talk in the press and House of Commons over 18-metre heights and 11 to 18 metres and loans and all that sort of stuff. This change, or the amendments to the fire safety order, have always taken on board buildings of all heights that are multiple occupancy. So this is far broader in its scope. It aims to amend the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005. 3 key things. One is making very clear, so clause 1 is making very clear that within a residential building, the order on the need to fire risk assess extends to the external walls, balconies, or attachments as they're called, and fire doors into the common parts, whereas before the assumption was it was just the common parts of the building. And then there was a discussion around what those common parts were. So this clarifies that from a scope perspective. The delegated powers for ministers, I'm struggling with that one really in terms of fully understanding what that means, but my understanding of it is that they can retrospectively change the scope rather than having to go back to primary legislation. But again, I'll defer to anybody that's got better legal knowledge than me on that one. And then clause 3 is the territorial extent. So this is applicable to England and Wales. There is some debate at the moment around whether this is an English votes for English laws vote on the 24th, or because it includes Wales, do the Welsh get to vote on it? Not sure, but this came up in the last few days. And again, I'm not, so maybe we can pick that up in the Q&A if someone else knows better than me. And then the commencement is around the 2 months from royal assent of the bill, it would commence, but there is a unclear discussion at the moment and lack of consultation response around the plan for the implementation of the bill. And I think this is based on risk-based guidance, which we'll come on to in a minute, that will sort of allow you to risk assess your portfolio and then say, where do I need to start doing these external wall assessments first? The other key thing that we're not sure of is what this will do to EWS 1. Will it effectively negate the need for an EWS 1 if you have a fire risk assessment which includes the external wall, or would you need the external wall fire risk assessment or the full fire risk assessment plus an EWS 1? Not sure. So there are a number of amendments that have been proposed by the Lords, which we believe will be voted on Wednesday. So the first one is the risk-based guidance for the fire risk assessment. So again, this is actually a government-produced risk assessment or risk methodology that risk assessors would use and work through, and responsible persons would refer to. So again, haven't seen the detail of that yet. That was due to come back in September, I believe. And I think the NFCC and Fire Safety Forum were working together on that, but we haven't actually seen a copy of the output. Lords Amendment 2, information sharing with residents. This is a big one for in terms of what we do, so residents and the Fire and Rescue Service. So that's looking at sharing external wall information with the Fire and Rescue Service. It's looking at sharing evacuation information with residents. there are a few other bits and pieces which just get in my mind at the moment, but a lot of information share. Monthly lift tests, sharing results of those with the Fire and Rescue Service. Again, we don't know yet how the Fire and Rescue Service would want to receive that information from a systems perspective, or how responsible persons would resource doing all of this work and sharing that information. So these are all sort of unknowns at the moment. It will also bring in annual flat entrance door inspections. So again, this is something that is moving on from the Grenfell Tower Inquiry recommendations. Lord's Amendment 3, Public Register of Fire Risk Assessments. This was put forward by Daisy Cooper MP originally, and then Baroness Pinnock in the Lords. It's one where they're talking about a publicly accessible register. It's possible, but we're not entirely comfortable with it. Our view always is one of the permissioning to people that have a legitimate interest to see that information. So that would be regulators, it would be residents, it would be local councils, fire and rescue services. Whether there is a requirement or a justification at the moment for a completely public register without having to do lots of redaction or create a sort of an abbreviated summary of a fire risk assessment, again, it needs to be worked through. So we're not entirely comfortable with this one, but it's moving in the right direction. And then the last one, which is the big one, and the one that residents are really concerned and excited and trepidatious about, is the remediation costs resulting from compliance with the fire safety order, and a prohibition on actually passing those remediation costs to leaseholders and tenants. It's known as the Mcpartlin-Smith Amendment now. That's the one that's coming back. And it seems at the moment that there will be a struggle to get significant or sufficient support to defeat the government on that amendment. The government's position is that this will be dealt with in the Building Safety Bill in terms of payment. Our retort to that would be, no, it won't, because the Building Safety Bill is only 12,000 buildings over 18 metres. It's not over 300,000 buildings at all heights. It has the building safety charge built into it, which is that sort of fast-track 28-day demand for payment that the responsible person can make. And it's also not going to deliver for years. And bills are landing now and have already landed through the Section 20 process for remediation. So I think all those things based together, it might not be the best place to put it, but it's probably the only place at the moment, as far as we can see, that would give innocent sort of residents in buildings that didn't create this problem some kind of degree of protection. So that's where we are. That's the very quick run through. Hopefully I've left enough time for conversation. I think I have. So really want to sort of throw open to questions. So what I'll do, I'm just going to look now. So the first one in from Reese. What link is there between findings like this and government regulatory reform? I'm sure we're all aware that it feels like government have their head buried in the sand in regards to reality. Ooh, start with a contentious one. My personal view is that immediately post Grenfell, very quick decisions, well, it's not personal view, it's reality, very quick decisions were made to identify other buildings that could be similarly at risk. And the focus at that moment really was on ACM cladding. As the government learnt more, and we learnt more about other types of external wall systems and other issues, I think it was just the government were kind of wedded to the ACM route and were very slow to actually embrace other issues, and still to this day are actively defending the lack of registration of fire risk assessments, for example, the self-regulatory nature of the fire safety order, despite huge amounts of evidence to the contrary. So that's just one area where I think it's almost as though there's too much to deal with. So we don't really have a clear route out of the hole that's been dug, and personal view is we're still digging the hole rather than starting to climb out. So that's the first point on there. I think on that one, I might bring in just very quickly Steve McKenzie, if Steve's with us. I can't actually see who's here.
Hi, Matt, I'm here. What questions do you want me to answer? Sorry, I was doing comments.
Oh, okay. So so Reece says it feels like the government have their head buried in the sand in regard to reality. So there's sort of disconnect between where we actually are and the reality of the reality of the situation and where government policy would say that we are.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a complete mismatch just now with government's whole crisis approach to Grenfell and the post-Grenfell building safety crisis. When I look at what Scotland's done or what the Australian state of Victoria has done, they've already considered many of these issues, have already implemented action, they've already changed legislation. The Australian case is particularly good because within 3 weeks of Grenfell, they already formed a very robust task group. By November of 2017, they actually published their first report, versus we've all been left trying to use multiple advisory notes, waiting for the Hackett Review, waiting for the Grenfell inquiry, and waiting for government to mobilise. The Australian state of Victoria has also done a government-led national, statewide audit of fire risk in their high-rise, not only cladding but means escape, whereas the UK government is consulting, considering, endeavouring, and dependent on housing providers and the private sector to deliver these risk-based audits. The data collection is using antiquated systems. We don't have, as I asked MHCLG directly in 2019, where is the funding, the resources, the capacity and capability to stabilise the current situation while they gear up with what we're going to do in the future? Why is it taken near 44 months to appoint who's going to head up the regulated regime? The government needs to wake up to residents hemorrhaging tens of thousands of pounds, bankruptcy, inbound, homelessness, and massive drawdowns on state aid through benefits and housing, which they just haven't modelled or considered yet. And they are penny pinching with the Building Safety Fund just now. 5 million doesn't cover a minimum, best case, £15 billion bill. If we start adding all the internal fire safety issues in, let's double that to 30 billion, and then let's model for worst case scenario of in excess of 100 billion, which is about the gross domestic product output of the construction sector. Head in the sand, sack the current minister, sack the current experts, and start with a more robust system that other countries have delivered.
Thanks, Steve. That was clear enough, I think. So the next question from Tom is, this is a good one. This is about the mood music from the RICS and the government taking. So he said that I'm talking about making buildings as safe as possible, and the RICS and government are trying to actively take buildings out of scope for EWS1. I think that's a really good point, because EWS1 oscillates between, depending on who you speak to, between being I can see thumbs down there as well, between being a measure of safety of a building from an external wall perspective, and then someone else will say it's a valuation tool and it's just lenders that need it and it's nothing to do with safety. I think the reality is, my view is that it talks very clearly about whether a building meets an adequate level of safety or not in the B grades. It's a safety tool, but it's dangerous in the sense that it isn't holistic, it's just the external wall. So I think whatever the government or the RICS do with EWS1, it doesn't get you out of your responsibilities under the fire safety order. So it kind of, to my mind, doesn't really matter. Responsible persons are responsible persons under law. They need to provide a suitable and sufficient fire risk assessment for the building, and they need to manage fire and life safety. Otherwise, they're breaking the law. So I don't actually really care what the RACS say on EWS1. Scrap it, expand it, do whatever you want with it. The law trumps this, and we're talking about fire safety. And I think with the fire safety bill coming through, the amendments to the fire safety order, it will really strengthen the position of the local fire and rescue services as the enforcement agency, and probably give them the, as my understanding is, some more of the powers that they probably have always needed and wanted but haven't had when it comes to residential buildings. So I think that would be my view on EWS1. So I'm reading off the phone as well with the questions. So Deepa has said, what are the how do we hold government and construction industry, developers, builders, manufacturers to account, if not the bills? I don't know. I think we will learn a lot more, or we are learning a lot more through the Grenfell inquiry at the moment, in terms of how did we get to this position. We look at building regulations, we look at the building inspection regime, we look at what the manufacturers may or may not have done, what the test houses may or may not have done, what the insurers are covering or what the insurers are not covering, warranty providers. There's a whole lot more that we need to go through at the moment, but that doesn't really help anyone today. And that's why we've always been very clear in our belief that the government have got to put the money forward. And then we've got to spend the next 10 or 15 years trying to sort out ultimately who pays for all of this. Our view as an organisation, and I think most of you that know us will realise that that isn't the innocent victims of the problem. We actually fall towards significant compensation, and we've talked before about PPI and Dieselgate and all the other scandals that have gone on, where not only has the money come back, but also there's been compensation for the suffering. We're not there yet. There's a long way to go. So next question from Karen. Right, this is a great point. So this is about these, so I'm reading these in real time. So the regulator with a limited budget, prototype of the kind of, yeah. So yes, I think we've got an open offer, and I'm sure lots of other people have, to the new regulator, to the HSE, to government, about providing any help that we can from a technology perspective, even if it's just throwing out ideas. We started offering a solution to the Ministry of Housing to deal with this around fire risk assessments and other bits and pieces in November 2018. So that's the first time we wrote to them and said, look, we think we can help, after the Hackett report came out and showed the deficiencies. That took until October, November last year, so 2020, to even secure a meeting to discuss the subject, to give you an idea of how this moves. So I can't speak for other providers, but somebody told me the other day that there's a digital working group that's been developed, and when I asked them who was on it, they gave me a load of names of people that have no involvement in any kind of digital technology as far as I can see. I was expecting to hear, well, Google are on it, and Hewlett-Packard, and various companies, Accenture, but it was a few random names, and that's a working group. I think it would be, I mentioned earlier, I think it would be a really good idea of other technology providers if we were to get together and say, what can we do? There are a few already, so we're doing some work with New Build Property Database. I think Jake might be on the call from Evidence, so we've started to talk. So I think we do need to get together and sort of say, look, what kind of standards can we adopt? But the key thing really is we move as many buildings from analog to digital as possible, because once they're digital, it's not a problem getting those digital systems, however many there are, to talk to whatever the building safety regulator builds. So I think from our view, the door is open. I don't know whether if Nikki wants to jump in on that, maybe from
yeah
database.
Yeah, thanks. So I guess, thank you, Matt, because obviously it's been a wonderful presentation, and I love the fact that we've got such an inclusive audience. I would say for anyone who doesn't know what we do yet, New Build Database captures almost like a DIY snagging list, but it also captures fire safety issues. So I'm doing something very similar to Matt, but at a lower level and less technically. So it's more straight to customer rather than at building level. Mine is at apartment level. So there's definitely some synergies in what we do, but mine is much more simplistic language than what Matt does, and Matt's definitely got a lot more of the technical detail. So there's a bit of crossover, but we're working at very different levels with slightly different audience. And Matt's definitely got more of the background knowledge than I do currently.
Great, thank you, Nicola. Another one from Deepa, sort of asking the question around the fire safety bill. And if the amendments to the fire safety bill don't work, that have been worked on so hard, what else should...
I think he's frozen.
Hello everyone, my name's Richard, I'm Matt's co-founder, and I'm just going to text him and try and get him back online now, but he has been suffering with some tech issues today, so if you bear with me just 2 minutes, I'll try and get hold of him for you.
Hi Richard, I mean, if you want to kind of field some questions, I'm happy to help while you get Matt back online.
Yes, please, if everyone would like to.
Is there any fire-related questions? I'm one of the independent experts that have been commenting heavily on post-Grenfell, quite a wide construction background, and delighted to help Matt and Richard and everyone today. I do actually like what Nicola's doing. I think there are so many gaps in post-Grenfell. We actually need a very, very big team to counter that of what industry and government's doing. So through Richard as an ad hoc chair.
Well, Matt's back, so we've got him back.
Apologies, I'm back on a mobile signal, so apologies for that. What did I miss? So yeah, I think we're talking about Deepa's question of what can we do. There's another level to the post this fire safety bill vote. So the consultation that closed in October last year is more about implementation and sort of further development of the fire safety bill. And I've been chasing that today, and apparently it will be published in the near future. So Lord Greenhouse said in middle of November that the consultation responses that they've received would be published very soon. We're now in middle of February, and the Home Office is saying in the near future. So I've written back and asked them to define what the near future is. Could we target a week or a month or a year, perhaps? Because I think it'd be interesting to sort of see what would happen next, and how much of the content of the amendments that are coming forward are actually picked up in what's being planned for the sort of the next wave of rollout of the fire safety bill. But I don't know, I'm not sure if we have any sort of legal constitutional people that understand how these bills work on the call. If there's anyone can put their hand up in the chat or something if they have a view on exactly how this works, because it's not really my specialist area, I'm afraid.
On Liz's question, do you mean, Matt?
Sorry, I was talking about Deepa's one, but yeah, no, sorry, because I dropped out for so long.
It's okay.
So remind me of Liz's question.
So sorry, Liz has asked a question in the chat. So her EWS1 was signed by a non-fire engineer. What can she do?
I can help with that.
Query. Yeah. So basically, query it. The RICS guidance doesn't actually definitively say that a chartered fire engineer has to sign off a B-graded EWS1. It says they should, or they could, or equivalent. So really what will happen with an EWS1 is that it may not be accepted by a lending bank if they don't believe that the person that signed it is adequately qualified or competent to do it. So I think going back to the managing agent and actually getting them to query the validity of the EWS1, and there has been quite a bit of fraud reported in relation to this, and I think there's quite a few that are maybe not fraudulent but not quite competent to do that work. And again, within the guidance for EWS1, there's no prescriptive way to do this. It's opinion based. So in my opinion, I might think the building's safe. In your opinion, you might think it's dangerous, and we might not agree with each other, but there's no definitive way to come to that conclusion. So again, that's something that needs to be queried, and you do need to be, and the other thing that you might want to do is get expert third-party review to say, this is the report that we've got. Before we go and spend millions of pounds, can we get another expert externally to review that work and peer review, and say whether they believe there are errors or omissions or gaps in the work that was in the body of work that was done that came to that conclusion. I hope that sort of answers the question.
So Matt, I thought, wasn't it only B2 that requires it to be a chartered engineer?
No, it's both B grades.
It's both, is it? Okay.
But it doesn't require it. That's the point. It should or could be, and we've raised this with the RICS that I don't see how you can have a document with so many shoulds and coulds. I think there's about 17 shoulds and coulds and maybes in the guidance.
I attended a webinar last week or the week before where RICS were on the panel, and even in their own presentation there was contradictions about which should be a chartered engineer and which shouldn't. So it really is as clear as mud. I guess my question to Liz would be if they've given you a refund for the cost of the EWS1, and if not, then that's probably a breach of contract or something you could explore legally.
I think, hi Matt, just to add, there is a bit of a land grab going on the back of the EWS1 where RICS and everybody's latched on to only using chartered fire engineers. The fire engineer profession covers a very wide bandwidth. There are other chartered professionals, chartered building engineers, accredited fire safety risk assessors, accredited fire safety managers who could carry out an EWS1, either A class or B class. Therefore, there is quite a bit of pushback from the fire sector itself. The RICS has went out to consultation on the EWS1 and its guidance and its training, but we're still not impressed by it. It's a wrong tool for the job. It is for lenders. If lenders have the concern, go out and assess the building yourself and build your own competency. And government, please stop funding failed private sector systems. The government's doubled down by giving them 70 million for training 2,000 of the RICS's own members, which creates a bit of a monopoly. So as someone that's qualified in multiple areas and professional registrations, it isn't working, abandon it, let's develop something better. And if the lenders want to have increased certainty about their risk exposure, encourage full Type 4 risk assessments that are building wide, look at internal and externals, encourage fire strategy reports that are robust, and then assess your risk as a lender or an insurer.
Brilliant. Okay. Thank you, Steve. I've got a couple of questions in the chat that I'm going to come back to, but I've noticed that Rob Burberry has raised his hand. So let's just unmute Rob, or if somebody can unmute Rob, because I can't for some reason. Hey, Rob.
Hi there, good evening, thanks very much. I think there was, were you asking a question about the legislative path that the bill will take? Like what's the next step? Okay, so there's good and bad news. So that we'll start with bad news because there is some good news. So the bad news is that the bill is at its pre-royal assent stage, which means there's been a lot of consideration already with regards to the bill. So the stage it's in now is called ping pong stage, which is not very formal, but what it means basically is that the Commons comes up with their amendments or their proposed bill. It goes to the House of Lords, and what we've got is the House of Lords have made several amendments. So now it's coming back to the Commons. If the Commons basically agrees with everything that the House of Lords says, then it's off to Buckingham Palace for royal assent. I think what we have to hope for, this is the positive bit, I think what we have to hope for is that there isn't agreement in the Commons with the way that the bill is currently proposed with the amendments from the Lords. So what I can see happening is perhaps the Lords' amendments will fail. The Commons will then have to put their version of what they want. It goes back to the Lords then vote, and this is why it's called ping pong. And this could actually carry on for who knows how long. If you ask the question, how long does it take for a bill to become an act? I mean, this could carry on for a long time. Arguably, one could say that, that for as long as any proposed act of Parliament doesn't become law and put costs on leaseholders, that's a good thing, especially if the amendment is looking like it won't pass.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Roy. That's really useful. I've learned something there. There's a couple of questions have come in about building safety managers and where they apply. So again, this is all subject to the Building Safety Bill. So they would apply to buildings that are within the scope of the Building Safety Bill. So at the moment, the scope is buildings over 18 metres or over 6 stories would require a building safety manager. There is the risk assessment, or the impact assessment for that says that a building safety manager could look after up to about 10 high-rise buildings. So then you'd be looking at 1/10 of their salary potentially. But I guess if you've got a management company that have got one building in Birmingham and one in London and one in Manchester, that might not necessarily work. So it could become more expensive. So there is a range. So in buildings below 18 metres or not subject to the bill at the moment, no requirement for a building safety manager, but it's within the gift of the Secretary of State to change that scope as I think it's called a delegated power or whatever, or statutory instrument or whatever mechanism you use to say, okay, we're now going to bring the threshold down to 11 to 18 metres, for example, within the scope of the regulator. So the opportunity for building safety managers to be put into much lower rise buildings is there, or other types of building. So that hopefully answers that one. Tom asked about the work we've been doing recently on EWS1. So this is a week or two ago, I put out a request to everybody if they've got an EWS1 form, be it a pass or a fail, a signed form, then please send it to us, because we wanted to do some analysis. And that was off the back of press reports that 90% of buildings fail EWS1. And from the small sample we already had, we couldn't corroborate that number. So we've asked for it. And on the basis that I think we've received about 80 or 90 so far, I need to get the exact numbers, but again, we still can't corroborate the number, even though most people that have got an EWS1 that are on Twitter talking about EWS1 are probably talking about it because they've got a fail grade and they've got a remediation bill. I think if you've just got a B1 and everybody's lending on it quite happily, the likelihood of you being on Twitter and being active in this debate and therefore seeing our message and sending us an EWS1 is quite slim. So we can't do it, but we look at the Fire Industry Association have launched their building safety information portal, which is the EWS1 register, and that launched in October, November last year, and as at today it had 5 EWS1s on it. That's right, 5 or maybe 6. They are all passes. They're all A1s and B1s. So we're looking at the moment around about 60% sort of B2 grading from our sample, but the sample isn't big enough. So I think if anyone hasn't sent us a copy of their EWS1 yet, please do, or tell your friends, because we do want to build that sample up. And we're also looking then at who are the firms, whether these blocks are social or private blocks, whether who are the assessors that are doing the work, what qualifications do they profess to have. So lots of different things to see whether we can see any trends in terms of how, are the particular survey firms failing everything they see? Are there some that pass everything they see, for example? What are the differences, and what can we analyse? And really this comes back to the fact that RICS never created a registration process for EWS1. So really nobody knows how many of these things are out there, what grades they are, who did them, are they insured or not as providers, is it all going to blow up and end horribly? Who knows, because nobody knows, nobody's counted, which as data people really makes us nervous and itch, and especially data people that are involved in risk management. This is a very toxic mix that we need to do something about, and we have been warning on since last March. So last question quickly from Greg. Why are lenders so reluctant to lend on properties where they are still insured? It was just as risky as it was 2 years. Okay, right, I'm thinking about this as about insurance. I'll do a very quick answer because we're coming up to the hour. Basically, the insurance industry will tell you that it's because they now, as a result of Grenfell, understand the risk much better. And therefore the likelihood of a total loss claim from an external wall fire is much better understood, and therefore they have to reserve more capital for it. The alternative answer is because of a lack of understanding, a lot of the insurers have run away from building insurance at the moment because it's too difficult and it's fraught with all the things we've just been talking about. So it's actually much easier to put your insurance capital into something where you're less likely to take a big loss. That leaves a far smaller pool of capital available for the same number of buildings. Prices go up, and then other people will look at that and say, well, if I'm the last man or woman standing and I can charge 500,000 for this, whereas I probably would have been happy with 4, it sort of works in the same way that the builder that doesn't need the work might price a job as opposed to the one that's desperate. So it's a supply and demand thing, and I think a lot more can be done by the insurance industry to help through this process and help understand and manage risk better. And again, our door is open to talk about that, and I'm sure all the other service providers are, to say, if we can give you better data, can you give more realistic pricing, please? And again, that is going on. So we've hit the hour. It's been a blast. I've got a bit of a headache because I've got about 2,000 WhatsApp messages here with questions I haven't managed to get through. So what we will do, we'll take a download of the questions, and then with a warm mug of cocoa tomorrow, we'll go through it. And if we haven't answered things or whatever, then we'll try and put some more answers out, probably in the public domain, so that other people can benefit that haven't seen today. And then if anybody has got any sort of direct, sort of detailed questions that they've got, please feel free to contact us, and then we'll have a one-to-one discussion. So on that basis, thank you very much, everybody. It's been great, and we won't leave it so long until we do the next one. That's a promise.